Hello, my name is Scott Lively. I'm a technical assistance advisor with NTIA. We are excited to have you here with us today and eager to get underway. Before we begin the presentation, it's my pleasure to welcome Molly Rittner, who is a senior policy advisor for high-speed internet with the National Economic Council. Molly has some opening remarks for us. Thanks so much, Molly.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you for having me here today. I'm really glad to be able to join. As you all know, President Biden's Bipartisan Infrastructure Law allocated $65 billion to connect everyone in America with affordable, reliable, high-speed internet and finally close the digital divide. Thank you to everybody on the phone today for joining us today, because this implementation effort, we've been saying this since day one, it's going to take a whole of nation effort. And you joining us here today on this topic of permitting, definitely a challenging topic, shows your commitment to this important vision. As you all know, this is not going to be easy. We're only going to be able to deliver on the promise of this historic legislation if we get environmental reviews and permitting right. That's why the president and the entire administration have been focused since day one on building a better permitting process to both expedite decisions and achieve stronger outcomes for our environment and our communities. We believe that these are complementary goals. I want to thank NTIA for bringing us all together today. Opportunities like this are really important because we know that to get this right, it's going to take collaboration from all levels of government, project sponsors, affected communities, and the more coordinated that our work is, the more likely we are going to be able to deliver on the projects on time and on budget. So a few updates on what we've been up to here in the administration. In May of this year, the president issued a permitting action plan that called on every part of the federal government to build a better permitting process. That requires three things. First, we need strong coordination across the federal government and with states, localities, tribes, and territorial governments. Second, we need to put in place strategies that ensure strong input from affected communities, particularly those who have too often been brought in too late or not at all, to execute these projects in a manner that is consistent with our values. And third, we are working on being more transparent, including through quarterly public release reports. This will help keep us accountable and work with agencies to react and try to unstick projects that might get stuck in the system. That all sounds easy when you talk through it, but we all know it's really hard, and it requires strong commitment to communication and getting the details right. Right now, agencies are working to finalize their action plans to meet those goals. So please do share input with us after this call or during this call. We in the administration across agencies really do welcome your feedback and collaboration along the way. Just to step back a little bit more broadly on permitting, we also were able to secure more than $1 billion through the Inflation Reduction Act to support environmental reviews and permitting processes. Currently, agencies are working to develop spending plans and personnel plans to use these resources to expand their capacity across all permitting and environmental reviews. While this capacity will be dedicated to an array of infrastructure projects, these resources can also expand the capacity that will facilitate communications reviews and will be paired with efforts to secure additional funding through regular appropriations so that we have the necessary capacity to ensure strong permitting outcomes. So back to the big picture, we are at such a huge moment right now. We have the opportunity to connect everyone in America with affordable, reliable, high-speed internet. And for the first time ever, we have the resources that we need to get this done. It's really a historic opportunity, but it's only going to become a reality if we all work together to ensure that these projects are welcomed by the communities they serve and that we get permitting and environmental reviews done expeditiously and in a manner that is consistent with our values. We look forward to working with you to turn that promise into a reality. And again, thank you for joining us today and learning more about the permitting process. And a big thank you to NTIA for providing this opportunity today.
We're really glad you've joined us today for preparing for permitting to accelerate broadband deployment. I know permitting is a topic that is on the minds of many. It's going to be a very important piece of ensuring that we have high quality, reliable, affordable internet built out to every American. So I'm really glad that we have Stephanie Henning and Amanda Pereira with us today, bringing their permitting expertise to help us all understand these issues better. I'll be talking a little bit about state and local permitting and also moderating our question and answer session at the end. Here you can see our table of contents, a quick overview of the different topics we'll be covering. Stephanie Henning is going to kick us off and talk about a little more detail about realty permitting, gaining access to various assets, and the process for doing so on both the state and federal level. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Stephanie.
Thank you, Scott. My name is Stephanie Henning. I am a federal program officer supporting the Tribal Broadband Connectivity Program here at NTIA, as well as doing some work with our interagency team to support coordination on permitting for our NTIA funded projects. And I'm here today to give you a little overview of what permitting is and the various requirements that you may encounter for permitting your projects on federally managed lands. All right, so what types of permits will a deployment require? There are lots of different things that are going to be going on in your projects. And one of the biggest considerations is making sure that you have the appropriate permissions to do the construction on the lands in question for your deployments. So in particular, you're going to be looking at easements to access government or private assets. These are generally going to be framed as rights of ways, but may take the form of other types of permission. And it is going to be required from pretty much anyone that you're working with, including governments, privately owned land, bridges, overpasses, railroads, buried deployment, running cables underground, or aerial deployment attaching cables to utility poles and tower builds. All of these are going to require permits. The federal government alone owns about 28% of land in the continental United States. And this is managed by many different federal agencies. Part of this process is also completing environmental and historic preservation compliance. All of our federally funded projects must perform a National Environmental Policy Act or NEPA analysis, as well as meet state, local, and or tribal government environmental and historic preservation permitting requirements. And we have resources to support you with all of these things. So what are the different types of assets and owners? We wanted to give you a quick overview of the different types of land or other property assets that you may be working with, as well as the types of owners of those assets that you would need the permits from. So this is anything from state or locally owned land, privately owned land, federally and tribally owned land, railways, bridges. We went over this on the last slide, all of these things. And the types of owners could be internet service providers, federal government agencies, state, local, or tribal government entities, personal ownerships like just you or me, the way that you own your home, utility companies, anything else along those lines. So who is engaged in federal permitting? Multiple federal agencies own land and require permits. And many may have their own specific permitting processes and required documents. Some of the big ones we want to make sure you're thinking about and paying attention to include the Department of Energy. So if you're going to be using anything with electrical transmission lines, Department of Transportation for interstates and highways, the military, so Department of Defense, Department of Agriculture for the U.S. Forest Service, Department of Interior for the Bureau of Land Management, Bureau of Indian Affairs, National Park Service, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Bureau of Reclamation. Also, the Army Corps of Engineers may be involved, as well as the General Services Administration, or GSA, for access to federally owned buildings. This is not a complete list, so make sure you're doing your research on the ownership of the lands and assets where you want to place your project. State, local, and private permitting. So as with federal permits, you will also need to obtain any permits from the relevant state and local authorities for state or locally owned land, as well as private land owned in your project area. You'll want to coordinate most likely with your State Department of Transportation and any other relevant agencies to obtain the required rights of way for those pieces of land. Be aware that they may have their own environmental, historic, or cultural preservation compliance requirements in addition to the federal NEPA process. These forms and processes will likely vary county by county and city by city, as well as across state agencies. So you want to make sure you're identifying the documentation and steps in those processes early and working with the relevant permitting authorities to make sure that you're on track for what you need. Keeping in mind as well that accessing private land in a given state county requires contacting the direct property owner for permission. They may have their own requirements for what they're looking for, and you'll likely still have to work through the local municipal or county government for the proper permits. All right, so there are many potential permits that you may be required to get for your project. A simple 1 mile deployment may require many different kinds of permits depending on the types of land and assets that are involved. So for example, for an aerial deployment that crosses a federal highway, you'll need to work with the Federal Highway Authority and potentially State Department of Transportations. If that highway runs over other federally owned or managed land, for example, land that's owned by the Bureau of Land Management, you would need to work with that federal agency as well, potentially, for obtaining the proper permits. Every federally funded project will require an end-to-end NEPA analysis, and you will work with your FPOs here at NTIA to make sure that our agency is supporting that effort. An aerial deployment that runs through a private household, let's say you're going across their land for that middle mile connection, you would need to get a rights of way permit from that landowner. For service to the actual household, you will need service line agreements to serve the actual household or business. Deployments that run through tribal lands will require specific permits for tribal access through the Bureau of Indian Affairs, but may also require other state and local permits as well, again, depending on the exact status of the land ownership. Deployments running through a city-owned park would require city or county permissions. And again, we already addressed if the highway or other asset is on top of or is based on its own easement through existing federally managed lands, you'd have to work with the underlying land management agency as well. So if that wasn't complicated enough, one thing we also want to make sure you're thinking about is paying really close attention to land ownership and instances of checkerboarding. Land in the US is often owned by multiple owners, requiring our applicants to seek permits through multiple owners or permitting authorities to fully access the land. So we want to make a quick note about checkerboarding. This refers to when land ownership is intermingled among 2 or more owners, resulting in a checkerboard pattern across a given area. This is typically common near railroads, private properties, forest lands, and tribal lands. To best prepare for checkerboarding, you want to be really confident of who the landowners are, and we recommend early coordination with all of the relevant permitting authorities as well as landowners. Early coordination and pre-meetings are going to be the best way to tackle this issue. You can see from our illustration here on the slide some of what that looks like. For example, you have a tribal reservation and next to it is privately owned land. Many of the individual tracts of land may be tribal, private, all up next to each other, either on or off the reservation boundaries. So really getting that land ownership data pinned down is going to be really critical for knowing who you need to work with for which specific permits. All right, planning for a successful process. There's lots of documentation required for your rights of way permits. We have here a list, not comprehensive, but an indication of some of the types of permits you may be required to collect. Application, the federal government uses the standard form 299, SF 299 for most federal agencies. The environmental and cultural study, or the NEPA analysis. You will need a legal description of the land areas that are being traversed or accessed through the rights of way. Any required fees or appraisals, including a fair market value assessment of the land for the easement, as well as any cost recovery fees required by the land management agency. You may need to show it landowner consent. This will be particularly relevant in tribal areas, but also for any privately held land. Period of construction, engineering and design information. You may be required to show evidence of bonding and insurance. There may be a traffic control plan, and you may be required to provide information on the contractor performing the work. Different state and local agencies may have various environmental and historic preservation requirements, as we've discussed. And again, early engagement is critical to understanding the requirements for each permit. And we strongly recommend you start reaching out to those points of contact now. All right, timeline of documentation. Again, this is just a generic general overview. This isn't meant to be exactly illustrative of what's going on, but we wanted to give you a sense of what happens at the different phases of the process. So while you are developing your application, most of those documents that we discussed on the last slide are part of what will comprise your application packet. Things that you'll want to start working on early include the environmental and cultural study, any fees or appraisals required, understanding that legal description, and putting together that application packet. Also, your confirmed landowner consent that may require some time to acquire, So you may need to start on that early. However, keep in mind that landowner consent must be accurate for land ownership on the date the application is submitted. So if there's a change in owners during the process, you would need to go get new consent. Once you submit your application packet, the land management agencies will go through a review of your application and all of the associated materials. Again, you may be required to pay some cost recovery fees as part of this process, as well as sign or countersign documentation. This will also be an opportunity to fix any errors in the application. Once you submit that application, agencies have 270 days to review that application packet and make a determination. Keep in mind that this is once they receive the complete application package. If you submit an incomplete application, for example, you're missing the bonding and insurance documentation, that would not be a complete application and the 270-day clock would not kick in. So you want to work really hard to make sure those packages are complete when you submit them. And again, pre-meetings and early engagement with the permitting authorities are going to be the best way to ensure that. All right, rights of way and other easements. How to apply for right-of-way or other easements. So we've given you a quick cheat sheet here on the high-level steps involved. Step number 1 is identifying the owner of the infrastructure or property to be used in deployment. Is it private, state or federal land, tribal land, local land? Understand who owns the underlying property will tell you who you need to work with to obtain the permit. So if it's a government-owned entity, identify the federal, state, or local agency with permitting authority for that piece of land or other asset, and identify the type of permit to be obtained and understand the process. Again, engaging early and scheduling pre-meetings to obtain all of your documentation and ensure that your applications are complete is one of the best things that you can do to ensure an efficient and effective application process. Once you've done all of this and compiled all of that information, you would submit your complete application packet to the permitting agency and then continue to stay in contact, follow up, and track your application. Again, as a reminder, there may be questions or tasks that the permitting agency has for you once they've received the packet. If they're correcting any errors, require you to pay cost recovery fees, or need any final documents to be signed, those are actions that you would have to be on the lookout for and make sure you're following up on. Right, the SF-299 for federal easement. So this is the form that we mentioned earlier. When beginning the process, be sure to use the correct application form. As I said, the SF-299 is a common form that's used by most federal agencies, and we have the link there for you to access that. It can be used for communication sites such as towers, as well as linear deployments of fiber. We have a list here of several of the agencies that use the SF-299. However, I will call out that the Bureau of Indian Affairs currently does not use that form. They have their own form that's accessible from their website at indianaffairs.gov. The reasoning behind that is because of the additional landowner consents required from tribal landowners. So again, you want to be really clear who is the actual permitting authority for the land you're looking at, so you're using the correct forms and working through the correct process. Again, this presentation is fairly specific to the federal context. State and local agencies will have their own processes. All right, and with this, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Amanda to give you some additional detail on the NEPA and environmental historic preservation requirements. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Amanda Pereira. I'm an environmental protection specialist, and I'm here to talk to you today about NEPA and EHP compliance issues. All right, so what is NEPA? Well, the National Environmental Policy Act, which was passed in 1970, is considered an umbrella law, and it provides a framework within which the federal government is able to consider the impacts of its actions before it takes them, and also as part of that consideration, comply with a number of other environmental and historic preservation laws and executive orders. So we've listed here some of the ones that can be addressed in the NEPA process, and it really does provide a way for us to be more efficient. It is intended to eliminate duplicative analysis. And one thing that's important to remember is NEPA does not contain a mandate for conservation. Other laws do, but NEPA is a process law. So it's this process that is going to really govern the actions that we take as we walk you through your compliance requirements. All right, so what does NEPA do? Well, NEPA provides us with an opportunity to evaluate the potential impacts of a proposed action, your project, on what we call the human environment. And so that's the natural environment, that's the built environment. We look at things like biological resources, historic resources, infrastructure, all of those things. And we do that through the preparation of some environmental analysis and documentation. And as I mentioned before, it does allow us the opportunity to address compliance requirements with a number of other laws and executive orders. It does allow us to consider environmental effects sort of on par with other issues that are typically used when determining project feasibility. So things like technological feasibility, economic factors, et cetera. It does require early consideration of environmental impacts. And we talk about doing NEPA early and often, which is a joke, but it really does just let us know that if we do it earlier in the process, we can make a better informed decision, which is really all that NEPA is about. The entire point of this process is for us to make an informed decision. And it does allow us to do so in an interdisciplinary way. And that is something that is really important because it also requires public involvement. So there are transparency requirements with NEPA, and an interdisciplinary analysis provides us with a way to do that. So there are three main levels of NEPA review, and I'll talk a little bit about these. There is a ton that I could say, but we'll just sort of get you started today, and we're available to answer questions if you have any concerns about what we mean when we talk about this. So the first level of NEPA analysis is something that we call a categorical exclusion. So a categorical exclusion, sometimes referred to as a CE or a CADEX, is something that is a defined category of actions that NTIA or the Department of Commerce has already determined do not have a significant impact to the environment. Now, when we are evaluating a project to determine if a categorical exclusion is appropriate to apply to the project, we also do review for what we call environmental considerations, also referred to as extraordinary circumstances. These are characteristics of the project that might mean that the application of a categorical exclusion is not appropriate. So whether the project has the potential to impact sensitive resources, if it's using new technology or new installation techniques, anything that really means that it doesn't fit within whatever was originally envisioned for the category. So we review for that. And then once we can make a determination about that, then the federal government would issue the determination of a CADEX. Now, in terms of timeline, what we have been seeing is in order to compile all of the information needed for us to properly evaluate for extraordinary circumstances, that's taking grant recipients on average 3 to 6 months. That sounds like a long time, but it also includes things like whether or not consultation is required. So if you have to talk to your state historic preservation officer, tribal historic preservation offices, anything like that must be completed before a CADEX could be applied. So that's really what we're seeing there. Is part of the reason for that timeline is just the time required to gather the appropriate information and also conclude any required consultation. From there, we are doing our best to get CADEX memos and documentation developed within 30 to 45 days. That may vary depending on workload at the time, but that's what we're estimating right now. Now, if we cannot apply a CADEX to a project, either because the project does not fit within a category of actions previously defined, or if it has extraordinary circumstances, which means, again, it's not appropriate to apply a CADEX, then an environmental assessment is required. An environmental assessment is a concise analytical document that evaluates the potential impacts of a proposed project against a range of resource areas. And they include the ones that I mentioned before: biological resources, water resources, cultural resources, infrastructure, etc. We do have guidance available that can provide you with a template and instructions for how to go about doing this. But once an EA is completed, then there will be one of two paths at that point. Either the EA has concluded that there's no significant impact to the environment, or it has concluded that there could be a significant impact. So if the EA concludes that there is no significant impact to the environment, then what we call a finding of no significant impact would be developed. That's a document that details the federal government's decision for this project. Now, the process is that once an EA is developed, usually takes around 6 to 12 months, depending on the project. It could be less, it could be more, but it varies widely depending on the circumstances of the project, the scale of the project, the types of resources that could be impacted, etc. NTIA would review draft and final versions of that document. Once the document was finalized, then it would be released for a 30-day public comment period and published on NTIA's website. At the conclusion of that comment period, then any comments received would be adjudicated and the FONSI would be issued by NTIA. Now, if an EA does determine that there could be significant impacts to the environment, an environmental impact statement, or EIS, would need to be developed. An EIS is the most in-depth form of analysis required under NEPA. It has very specific guidelines with regard to public involvement, and it is more time consuming. They typically take on average between 18 to 24 months to complete. And the process for an EIS would be the same in that once the document was finalized, it would be put out for a public comment period. At the conclusion of that comment period, comments would be adjudicated, and NTIA would issue what we call a record of decision, which is the decision document for an EIS, and it codifies the federal government's analysis and plans to move forward. All right, so in order to prepare for this for BEAD states and territories, and please be aware this is specific to BEAD, but the NEPA process is something that all grantees will need to be familiar with. For BEAD, though, in the initial stages, We want to make sure that eligible entities are reviewing available resources. We have some on NTIA's website, and also getting an understanding of what the requirements may be as they move forward with their subgranting process. If you have questions about that, please do contact NTIA. We'd be happy to help answer any questions and provide any guidance. If you don't have in-house expertise with regard to EHP issues, then we would recommend that you hire EHP-focused staff or contractors so that you have folks with the capability to understand this process, how to navigate it, and help get you through your requirements as you move forward with your funding projects. And then finally, we want you to go ahead and outline an approach for your EHP activities. So at this point, be giving some thought to how you are going to manage the influx of projects coming in from subgrantees when you get to that point, and how you're going to manage their EHP analyses and working as sort of the intermediary between the subgrantees and NTIA. So we want to make sure that you've given some good thought to this. We know that EHP is on the critical path. EHP issues do need to be addressed before any projects can begin, and we want to set up everybody for success. So please do let us know if we can answer questions or be of any assistance as you are getting prepared for this component of your work. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Stephanie.
Thanks, Amanda. That was great. I'm just going to do a quick recap here of some of our best practices for applicants as you're working through this process. All right, so some best practices for tracking and actively following your applications. It's going to be vital to ensure that all deadlines and dates are being met. So as I've said a couple of times already, make sure your applications are complete. This is one of the things we hear as being the extremely common driver of delays in the permitting process, is when applications are submitted to permitting agencies incomplete or with many inaccuracies that need to be fixed. So to solve this, or to address this, again, we strongly recommend early engagement with those permitting authorities. Reach out to the local field offices for where the projects are located and understand the exact requirements, and work with them as you are developing your application materials to ensure that what you are submitting is going to be what's required. Be responsive. Another major setback that we hear about is the amount of lag time in communications between permitting agencies and applicants. So if there is a cost recovery fee that's required, make sure you're keeping track of that and paying that in a timely fashion, as reviews may not start on your application until that fee has been paid. Fixing errors in a timely manner when you're notified of them will also be critical to moving a package along, as well as keeping track of when those decisions come in, as your agency may be required to sign additional documentation confirming the right-of-way or other easement. So there's many pieces that may come back to you for action. Being responsive to those will be extremely helpful in moving your package along. Also, as we're in the same line, tracking the timeline and being timely. So ensure all permits will be completed in a timely fashion for proper post-award deployment. There's lots of these going on. We expect most of you to be working with multiple agencies at various levels with many different permitting requirements. And so careful attention should be paid to ensure that these applications are being completed and processed in a timely fashion so your projects aren't delayed. Okay, and with that, I will hand it back to Scott. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much. Right now, I'd like to remind everyone, if you have questions, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A box. We'll try to get to as many of those questions as we can during our Q&A session at the end. So Stephanie earlier talked about easements and various other ways to gain access to assets. Amanda talked about EHP, both of them covering the material very ably, and both really are types of permits, and various types of permits fall under each umbrella, but any broadband project is going to probably confront scenarios in each of those boxes, both easements and EHP. And of course, a federally funded project is going to require end-to-end federal EHP. So Thank you, Amanda and Stephanie, for covering that ground. I'm now going to close us out by talking about a very important piece of the BEAD NOFO. Of course, there are no unimportant parts of the BEAD NOFO, but you'll notice that in your initial and final proposal that states and territories are required to review their own state and local permitting statutes, regulations, and processes, and find ways to streamline those permitting processes and make them more efficient to get your states and territories ready for the BEAD program, to ensure that your own state and local rules and processes are not unnecessarily holding up any of these projects. So the idea is certainly not to undermine the purpose behind any of these permitting requirements. Again, it's to make sure that your own state or territory rules or processes are not unnecessarily delaying broadband deployment. So you can see the requirements for the initial and final proposal here. You'll describe your efforts in those proposals. And right now I'm going to talk about some potential reforms that some of your states and territories have probably made already, or you've at least adopted some variation of these reforms. These are just some ideas to get you started. There's different ways to reform permitting. If you do pursue changes, it's certainly, no one is saying it's going to be easy, especially if you need to pursue those changes legislatively. That's obviously going to be more time consuming, but this review of state and local permitting and attendant reforms, if necessary, is going to be really important to us achieving internet for all. So if there is one overarching theme for permitting reform, it is streamlining. The aim is to make the process more efficient by avoiding unnecessary delays. So do the permitting agencies have sufficient staff to process the applications in a timely fashion? Are multiple forms required for the applicant to fill out when one could be used? Earlier, Stephanie discussed the SF-299 common form that applicants must fill out when seeking a right-of-way for most federal agencies. You may want to pursue a similar initiative to simplify the number and complexity of permitting applications. Other ideas to consider: offering expedited permitting for minimally invasive construction practices, or possibly adopting e-permitting. Also consider the appropriate sizing and location of conduits, small cells, and other broadband infrastructure, and whether to require excess capacity within conduit to meet future needs, a requirement also known as dig once. Dig once policies encourage or require infrastructure project owners to install multiple conduits and sometimes microducts within those conduits for future use. This can reduce future costs and minimize disruption to services. We are going to discuss dig once at length here in a few minutes. Several states have already had a lot of success with permitting reform. Indiana and Wisconsin both have implemented broadband ready communities programs. Those programs incentivize local governments in the state to reduce unnecessary barriers to broadband investment. Certainly worth taking a look at those programs if you have not already. Also, you can see a link at the bottom as an additional resource. Pew has a nice overview of just the various permits that a broadband deployment may require. Most broadband deployments are going to require placing fiber or other cable. Even wireless deployments will require placing cable that will serve as backhaul that connects the wireless towers to the network core. The buried deployment is just what it sounds like, running fiber or other cable underground, which may require digging trenches if conduit is not already in place. So buried deployment brings obvious advantages in terms of longevity and resiliency, but digging, if it's necessary, can represent a large portion of overall broadband deployment project costs. And that leads many to implement dig once policies to help reduce deployment costs and minimize disruption. So how do dig once policies reduce broadband deployment costs? If conduit's already in place, fiber can be installed in the ground without the project owner having to spend time and money trenching. The states and territories are the experts as to what policy vehicle should be used to make permitting reforms, if any are made at all. Legislation, of course, is typically more difficult to pass, but has greater force of law. Executive orders are another option. North Carolina has a dig once executive order for transportation projects that requires notice of joint trench opportunities that allows other providers to negotiate a joint access agreement to install conduit. Also, think about who should own the conduit in your public rights of way. Illinois requires dig once by legislation, and the state pays for the conduit, owns it, and leases it to providers. State ownership, of course, brings greater control of the conduit, but will also require more resources for oversight and administration. To be effective, the dig once policy should ensure that once in place, the conduit is accessible to other infrastructure, whether that is power lines, sanitation pipes, or whatever it may be. As is normally wise when making public policy, try to involve stakeholders on the front end to alleviate concerns regarding cost increases. If someone's bottom line is going to be affected, you know they'll want to be heard in the process of developing the policy. If affected stakeholders feel left out, they begin making calls to various officials in high places, possibly leaving you in a position where your reform ends up going nowhere. So please take stock of the policies in your state, where there are dig once policies, who owns conduit, and where streamlining reforms can be made. Each state's stakeholder engagement process can help with gathering this information from state and local permitting agencies and other sources. So broadband lines, of course, either go in the ground or through the air, and that leads us to aerial deployment policies, which often implicate pole attachments. Pole attachment policies address rates, access requests, timelines, procedures to mediate disputes, and other terms and conditions for attaching a broadband line or anything else to a utility pole. The process and cost can sometimes delay a deployment. If you plan to pursue pole attachment reforms, there's a number of things that you should consider. First, who regulates the poles in your state? Federal law gives the FCC authority to regulate pole attachments, but allows states to pass laws to exempt themselves from the FCC's regime and self-regulate. Roughly half of states have done this. It's good to determine what category your state is in. Right now, we are dropping a link into the chat so you can see the FCC's latest report on which states have opted out of the FCC regulation for pole attachments. There is one wrinkle with respect to regulation I should note, in that the Tennessee Valley Authority works with the FCC to set rates and other policies for broadband providers to attach to poles owned by local power companies within the TVA system. States that have passed laws to self-regulate take various approaches to pole regulation. For example, Illinois grants authority to local governments to regulate poles within specific parameters laid out by the state, such as requiring permitting decisions within 45 days. In Idaho, pole owners are in charge of reaching pole attachment agreements with attachers, but if the parties cannot reach an agreement, then the state PUC will set rates, terms, and conditions. It's important to note that for states whose poles are regulated by the FCC, those rules do not apply to cooperatives or municipalities, which are often major pole owners. So in those instances, the poles are self-governed by the municipality or the cooperative. Whatever approach your state or territory takes, you can make progress by aligning policies for all pole owners, including municipalities and cooperatives, and work with these groups to address their specific circumstances and needs. And of course, be aware of the economic impacts of pole attachment policies on pole owners. Particularly in rural areas, pole owners typically install more poles per customer and have smaller customer bases on average, so they rely more on revenue from pole attachment fees. It's the very same policy development concept we talked about with dig once. Bottom lines could be impacted. Affected stakeholders will be heavily invested in outcomes. So work closely with those pole owners at the outset if you plan to make pole attachment reforms. Individuals and agencies should be prepared for a large increase in IJA-related permitting applications, not just for broadband deployments. Talk to broadband providers to understand what permits will be required for deployment, and also learn about past experiences with state or local processes. Talk to the state permitting agencies about reforms and determine if they have the staff and other resources needed to handle the increase in applications. All affected stakeholders should identify ways to expedite the permitting process while still protecting all interests at play. Here is a more specific call to action for applicants and state and local governments regarding all of these anticipated permitting requirements, be they state, federal, EHP, or rights of way. For those who are planning to pursue BEAD awards, identify all appropriate landowners and agencies that must grant access for the deployment. Prepare early for a NEPA EHP analysis if you're going to be receiving federal funding. Engage early and schedule pre-meetings with all relevant agencies to ensure application completeness. Submit all required documents and track the timelines, and learn about all relevant permitting, OTMR, dig once, and other policies planned or implemented in your area. So for state and local governments, please fully understand all required permits and processes in your area, not just those focusing on broadband deployments. Encourage a streamlined permitting process with ideas such as simplifying the number of permits, defining parameters, acquiring excess capacity, and encouraging dig once policies. Finally, assess your current capacity to handle the influx of permits and make adjustments accordingly. So with that, we again thank you for joining us. This slide deck will be available online on the Internet for All website. And Stephanie and Amanda and I will now look forward to taking your questions. To the extent we don't get to some of them, there are many ways you can reach us. Probably the easiest of which is to send an email to bead@ntia.gov. Or you can get in touch with the FPO from NTIA who works with your state. If you go to the Internet for All website in the top right-hand corner, you can click on Map, and that will take you to a page that will tell you who is the FPO for your state and give you the contact information. So we look forward to the discussion right now and to working with you all going forward. Thanks very much. Okay, we got some really good questions in the Q&A, which we appreciate. So let's go ahead and dive in. Okay, are NEPA analysis required for deployments on existing poles and in existing rights-of-way, given that providers can access these rights-of-way and poles for repairs and vegetation management today? Is there a way to expedite this process to avoid delays due to expected resource constraints of many of the public land offices? Amanda, why don't you kick us off with that one?
Sure thing. Thanks for the question. This is a good question. It comes up a lot. So NEPA analysis is required, even if you're putting aerial fiber on existing poles, even if you're working in a right-of-way. We do anticipate that in some circumstances, using existing poles or using existing rights-of-way can actually streamline your compliance requirements. However, it does not negate the need for them. One thing I do want to emphasize is that even if NTIA is able to apply a categorical exclusion, that does not necessarily mean that any other agency might not have an interest and an obligation to review your project. What we are trying to do as much as possible is to coordinate with other federal agencies that may have an interest or obligation in reviewing projects so that we can minimize any and eliminate any duplicative analysis wherever necessary. But it is something that just to be aware of. And again, as I mentioned in the presentation, we do still have an obligation to review for extraordinary circumstances. So using a right-of-way is a good thing to do, but a lot of rights of way were established before, for example, the National Historic Preservation Act obliged the federal government to look at its impacts on cultural resources. Threatened and endangered species don't usually respect rights of way, and rights of way very often go through wetlands and rivers and all of these things. So it doesn't get us away completely from compliance requirements that we have.
Thanks so much, Amanda. And unsurprisingly, we received a number of NEPA EHP related questions. Here's another one. The EHP review process can be very lengthy What specifically are federal agencies doing to streamline and or speed up the review process? Stephanie, I'm going to pass that one to you first.
Scott. So the federal agencies are working on a range of initiatives. We know that this is a high priority and something folks are concerned about, not just for BEAD and TBCP, but for all of the infrastructure programs that are going on right now. So specifically, NTIA does participate in the streamlining federal permitting work stream of the American Broadband Initiative, where we meet bi-weekly with representatives from the various land management agencies as an opportunity to share information and discuss any issues that we're coming across. We also have an MOU in place with Bureau of Indian Affairs, I'll let Amanda talk about, and are continuing to engage at multiple levels with our colleagues at the land management agencies to do everything we can to keep track of these projects and ensure they're moving forward as efficiently as possible.
Stephanie.
Yeah, thanks, Stephanie. So yeah, we do have an MOU with BIA. And what that does at this point is it allows NTIA to be what we call the lead agency for these BEAD, middle mile, TBCP, et cetera, projects. And that means that basically our NEPA process is sort of what governs the process, but we do work cooperatively through them or for them to help you navigate your requirements for both agencies. So again, the goal is that by the time you've produced any analysis that's required, it satisfies the requirements for both agencies, and we're minimizing or eliminating duplication. One other thing I want to mention is that NTIA is working with the Council on Environmental Quality to put forward new categorical exclusions that will provide us with a greater range of tools to apply to some of these grant-funded actions. That is still in process, but it is something that we're very heavily engaged with, because even though CADXs are not necessarily a golden ticket, they are still a really useful tool. And we are working very hard to make sure that we have more tools available to support these efforts. And as Stephanie mentioned, we are doing a lot of reaching out to other federal agencies who are either funding agencies or resource managing agencies so that we can coordinate as much as possible and minimize or eliminate any duplicative analyses or efforts.
Thank you both. And I just want to add, permitting processes, whether they're state or federal, there's lots of room for improvement, for streamlining, for improved staffing, expanded staffing. I covered a lot of ground in the presentation earlier about the BEAD NOFO requirement for each state to review its own state and local permitting rules and regulations and make necessary reforms. And that's in the NOFO because that is something that states can assert some control over. But it certainly does not mean that the onus is on states to solve all of permitting. There are issues that need to be worked out on the federal side as well that Stephanie and Amanda just outlined, the efforts that are already underway. Let's move on to the next question. Does it make sense for an entity seeking permitting approval to first work with state and local governments and then apply through the SF 299, the federal form, given that that form includes a question about whether you've already received state or local permits to build? This is a really great question, and I appreciate that you all are thinking strategically about these things and how to process them efficiently. At the same time, there obviously can be a fair bit of uncertainty in these processes, so I think it is best to pursue approvals concurrently to avoid any unanticipated problems. You would hate to delay the beginning of one process because you're waiting on the other, and that ends up making the entire process unnecessarily long because the state process takes an unexpectedly lengthy amount of time. So Stephanie, do you have anything to add to that?
I think that makes sense. And again, just sort of going back to the point of early engagement, we would recommend that you talk to the various agencies involved to understand what their timelines are and what their preferences are. That's going to be your best bet on understanding for any given situation what's going to work best.
We have a question It says, can you share how the NEPA approval process will play out with the BEAD grant recipient when there may be dozens or hundreds of individual projects in simultaneous motion within the state or territory at the sub-grantee level? In summary, we're going to have a bunch of projects going at once, not even just under NTIA programs. There's also Treasury programs. There's Reconnect, there's state programs. There's just a lot happening at once. How is that going to work? Amanda has the answer.
It's a lot of pressure. So we're not really trying to prescribe how states would conduct their individual programs, but what we are hoping to basically have in place is for that you all to be almost like the traffic cop, so that you work with your sub-grantees to make sure that whatever is submitted for EHP review up to the federal level for NTIA, for example, is in as final form as it can be. Also, if you are having problems working with or reaching out to any resource managing agencies in your states or your regions, let us know. That's what we're here to help with. If you have questions, if you need technical assistance in terms of helping to communicate to your sub-grantees what they need to be providing, that's also something we can lend support with. In terms of handling the considerable volume of work, that is one of the reasons why we are strongly recommending that at this point, folks be thinking about an EHP strategy, engaging either qualified staff or qualified consultants to help manage that. For its part, NTIA is also staffing up and bringing on support so that we can, as efficiently as possible, manage the workload that will be coming to us when you all are preparing to submit your project information for review.
Thank you, Amanda. And we are getting close to time here. We have another question asking about funding. It kind of dovetails nicely with the question that Amanda just answered. And that's what sources of funding are available for states. We know that Congress has made additional funding to federal agencies to process permitting. What are the states to do with the increased workload? I think this is something we're going to provide more specific guidance and assistance with in the future. But I would say generally that program funds can be used to help with processing program projects. And that's a very general high-level answer, more specificity to come on that one. Stephanie, if you could talk for a minute about the FPISC, that would be great.
Yeah, so also just for folks' awareness, if you the Federal Permitting Infrastructure Steering Council, I think is what that acronym is. I get it wrong every time. Also known as FPISC, or the Permitting Council, in the recent Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA that was passed earlier this year, they received $350 million to support the new Environmental Review Improvement Fund. I believe they're still working out the details of exactly how that fund is going to be administered and all the specifics around that. However, part of the function of that fund is to provide support to state, local, and tribal governments in processing environmental reviews and permitting for infrastructure projects. So again, that's not something where NTIA is going to have the final, say on any of that. We're not running that program, but we are aware that that's something that's been made available from FPISC, and we would recommend touching base with them to see what engagement may be available there, what support might be available.
Thank you, Stephanie. Last question. What about utility pole replacement? We're hearing this quite a bit. There's going to be extra burden on poles, increased attachments. What if the pole needs to be replaced? Does NEPA apply in those instances? Amanda, you can wrap up the Q&A with that one.
Yeah, so NEPA does apply to pole replacement, but that does not necessarily mean that you would need to do an environmental assessment for replacing a single pole. It's going to depend a lot on the scale. If you're just replacing a single pole, then that's something that we can probably address in a fairly concise and efficient manner. If you're going to be replacing, 50% of the poles along a 500-mile stretch of aerial fiber, then that might require a little bit more analysis. So it's going to depend on the specifics of your project. But overall, yes, NEPA and EHP considerations do apply.
Thanks so much, Amanda and Stephanie. And that brings us right to 4 p.m. Eastern time. Again, we really appreciate you all joining us. We appreciate all the great questions. We really look forward to working with you all going forward. I know we have a common mission of getting everyone high quality, reliable broadband. We look forward to working with you toward that end. I think the link was put in the chat a few times. You will be able to access this presentation. You can watch it over and over again at your leisure, and the slides will be available online as well. Thank you all again for joining us. Hope you have a great evening.